What's up guys, this is bluetea-TCG back with another Vanguard video. This video will be the accompanying combo demonstration for the Silver Thorn Pale Moon deck profile that I presented in my most recent video. Let's go ahead and go over the most important combo that's necessary to pilot the deck when you're running Lantina as your primary stride. So before we go into the combo itself, setting up Lantina before the attack, here's what I got in my soul. Basically, you just gotta, in order to prepare for the Lantina turn, you have to figure out what you're missing. In this case, you generally want to have at least 2 Zelma. We have the second one in our hand here, so we're probably good for the turn, but it wouldn't be bad to get a third. The other card you'll want is, if possible, you'll want Megalorude, basically a card that allows you to call from Soul in order to remove the potential Honol that your opponent may have. So that's what we'll be fetching off of our Lillian that's in our hand. With the counterblast. In terms of what else you need, you do want to have at least 1 Breathing Dragon, but if you don't have the Breathing Dragon, then you'll want a number of Rising Dragons. But in this case, we have a Breathing Dragon, which we'll be calling out multiple times to ensure that we stack our rear guards to high power numbers. So let's go ahead and begin. We'll start with the Lillian, called from hand. Use the skill Counterblast, and we search for Megalorude. In this way, we can also see what else is in our deck. We've got plenty of triggers left, so we definitely want to try to use at least 1 Emil if possible, just in order to thin the deck a bit better. So we get this shuffle, and then Megalorude goes to Soul, so now we have everything that we need in order for Lantina to be basically really easy to trigger, as well as remove the Honolly of the opponent. Now the other thing we'll need to do is to call enough hands to our rearguard circle, so we have 2 options here. We have either Selvia from hand, or we have Dixie into Selvia from Soul. As you can see, we have the Selvia and Soul, so both options are very reasonable here. We're just going to do the Dixie, so because we want the Dixie in the deck. So we're going to call Dixie, use the skill put on the top, call it the Selvia. Want to make sure to call it to an Excel circle so that it gets better power than it otherwise would. And then we shuffle this up. So then we use Selvia's skill. We want to counterblast, and then we call out 2 things from Soul. We can call out here. Well, we have to call out Breathing Dragon for sure, so we can call that here. And then we can call a Zoma. This is how we begin stacking our rear guards. So we've called these both out. Breathing Dragon will trigger because it was called out to back for a rear guard circle. We can Soul Blast, so we obviously Soul Blast the Irina that we never need. And then our front or rear guards will get +5 now. And then we'll use Zelma to put Breathing Dragon to Soul and call it back out. So we Soul Blast again, and of course we're going to Soul Blast the Ana we don't need. And we're going to give our front or rear guard circles +5 again. So now our bonus right now is +10, which is 2 stacks. Alright, we still have plenty we can work with in our hand. So we're going to go ahead and call the Zelma again. And we can either use the Zelma to put Breathing Dragon into Soul and do it again, or we can put the Zelma into the Soul and then call something else out. It doesn't really matter, to be honest, because we have enough beat 6 in our hand to call. But I just want to give you guys the thought process so that you can know what the possibilities are when you yourself play this deck. So we're just going to do the Breathing Dragon. We're going to put into Soul, call it back out, and then we're going to Soul Blast again. These are all the available options. I think we can Soul Blast the Venus Lucia safely. You wouldn't normally do this, but because we are going to get basically a grade 3 to hand anyway, like we don't really need the Venus Lucia. So it depends really. If you don't feel confident that you're going to kill this turn, then you can instead Soul Blast like the other Breathing Dragon, for example. But it's nice to have that safely, another copy in your soul, just in case this gets removed somehow. So that's going to give another +5 to our front row circles, and now we have 3 stacks. So the last couple things we want to do, you want to call. So basically, this is just to maximize the number of attacks before Lantina's skill. So we'll call Rising Dragon, use the skill to put this Breathing Dragon to Soul and draw a card. And we drew a Lilith, which is fine. In fact, we could even call this Lilith to this Excel circle, but instead we're just going to call it Lillian because it's a little bigger. Alright, now our field's all set up and ready to go to battle. So notice how we maximized the number of circles we called out because we had enough counterblast. Not only that, but we didn't have to spend too many cards from hand to do so. We're still 4 cards in hand, and we're going to have plenty more at the end of our turn. In cases where you know you won't have a lot of cards left in your hand, it's a lot better to just call out Selvia from Soul, build your field slightly, like up to that 4 cards that I mentioned earlier, and then that's when you go into your turn. Of course, you won't be able to probably stack Breathing Dragon as much before your Lantina procs, but this is usually good enough for ensuring the kill. let's go to battle. We basically attack with all of these first in whichever order you'd like. Just be aware that you need to play around any potential battle phase shenanigans that your opponent might have based on their clan. So this attack is 14 plus 15, which is 29. This is 39. This one is, and we have 4 different names to show that it is indeed 39. So this one is, see, 34 plus 8, 42. This one, this was, we call it plenty more than 4 cards, so this gets plus 20. So 37 plus 15, 52. So notice how big our numbers are before we even proc Lantina, right? Like this is all, like they can guard with 1 card if they wanted to, but they're gonna have to deal with these attacks before we even go to Lantina. And now when our Lantina attacks, of course, we're not gonna boost because it doesn't matter. But then we're gonna counterblast for Lantina's skill and then discard. We can discard the Sylvia. And then we put all of our rear guards into Soul. And as I mentioned, guys, having 2 Zelma is plenty in order to just be set for the game. You don't really need more than 2 Zelma, but having at least 2 is ideal. So now we're going to proceed to call up to 8, or actually up to 14, but in this case it's going to be only 7 because that's all we have space for. So let's call them out. No matter what, you'll have to call out Megalorude because that ensures that we get that grade 4 to fulfill the 4 different grades. And then we'll call Dorian for the grade 3. And then, of course, you'll want to call Breathing Dragon. You don't have to, actually, but I like calling it, you know, this is my personal preference. And then I also like calling Ana just to free up a bit of our counter charges. We don't have to do this because depending on how your board looks afterwards, you might not necessarily need it, but it's still nice to have, especially if you decide to go into Sylvia again, which is an option here, but we're not going to. So for sure, we're going to call out, so we have 1, we need to call out 2, so this is 2, and then Breathing Dragon, or we don't need to call this Breathing Dragon just yet. We can call out 2 Zelmas here, and this is good enough. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. This suffices for our board. So now we have 4 different grades called out. The Guard District is online. Our opponent will have to deal with that. And then, of course, we can use Breathing Dragon's skill. Soul Blasting 1 card out of our soul. We can Soul Blast the Lillian because we don't need this many. And then that puts us at 4 stacks. So now we don't need to proc Breathing Dragon anymore. I think it's done more than the job that it's needed to do. So we're good there. And then we can use Ana to put a couple more of these cards into soul and countercharge. So we can put those 2 into soul and countercharge. And then Megalorude, we can either put our own card into soul or we can put our opponent's Honolly. Now, if your opponent doesn't have a Honolly, you might be asking, what would be the best card of ours to put in the soul? Well, you can decide to put Dorian in the soul. It depends where you actually want to use it at the end of the turn. But actually what I like doing is putting Zelma into the soul because Zelma will still resolve. It's still in standby. Despite being put into the soul, it doesn't need to stay in the rearguard circle to resolve. So you can actually put it into the soul and it'll still like trigger. So then for this Zelma, we can decide, okay, we can put this Zelma in the soul and then call something like Sylvia out. That'll give us 2 additional cards to call out. Of course, we don't need to spam as much as we did with upper line build because we already build the stacks as needed at this point in the game. But if you want to play around defensive triggers a little more, let's say your opponent probably got 2 defensive triggers, then you might want to stack your Breeding Dragon just a little more. So we'll go ahead and put this Zelma into soul, assuming that they didn't have Honolly, and this gets plus 15. Here we go. But this might not stay, I'll just warn you guys already. And then we can use the Zelma that we put in the soul here, put this in the soul, and call out not that Breeding Dragon. Let's focus on the Breeding Dragon loop separately. So off of this Zelma, we can call out Sylvia. And then the Zelma that we just put in the soul, off of the Zelma that was put in the soul by Megalorude, we can use that Zelma to put this Sylvia into the soul. Because Sylvia is going to be in standby now that it was placed in rearguard circle. So we can put that in the soul and call out another Rising Dragon. And then that way we have now the Sylvia that we put in the soul. We can proc that. So counterblast 1, call out 2 more cards from soul. So now we can call either 2 more Zelmas or we can call out a Zelma and a Breathing Dragon because that helps us a bit with defensive triggers. So we call it the Breeding Dragon. We use that skill to Soul Blast. And at this point, we've procced Rising Dragon enough where we can put some of these into soul. Like, let's say we can put this into soul and draw one, just to cycle one card, and that turned out to pay off. So we go ahead and do that. And then we can use Breathing Dragon to Soul Blast, and then give the +5. And then we use Zelma. We can put this into soul and call out either a Breathing Dragon or a Lolette. Calling out Lolette is saying that, okay, I respect the fact that my opponent might survive. Breathing Dragon is saying I have no respect for whether my opponent will survive. They will die. So let's go ahead and call Lolette, because we're going to show the Breathing Dragon loop separately, and I feel like it's worth just sticking with this. So those are all the resolutions that we have. We can also put this Lolette into soul if we wanted to, off of this Rising Dragon that we did not proc at all. Actually, in fact, we want to use this Rising Dragon to put this in the soul and draw one, because it's just the best thing to do here. Pay it off again. And then we go ahead and drive check. So this is 27. We do the triple drive. A lot of triggers there. The third one is a Zelma. Oops. Okay, so that was our drive checks. And then each of these is going to be a lot of power. So this would be +20. So 37 plus 25, 62. This would be 60, I think just 60. Let's see, 35, yeah, 60. And then this one would be 37, 42. This one would be 15, 20, 45. So look at how big the numbers are. All of those are going to be 2 or more guard restricts. So if they got a lot of defensive triggers, they're still going to have to deal with those, along with the attacks that we did before. The Lantina was activated, and then at the end of the turn, let's say they survived, we still get to do the standard end of turn procedure. We put this back in the G zone. These go away. We use Lolette to put herself and Dorian into the soul, countercharge, add a grade 3 from soul to hand. That was the grade 3 that we got off of the draw from Rising Dragon. And then we use Dorian, put all these into soul. We draw 2, and then add a grade 3 Silver Thorn from soul to hand. So that's of course going to be the Dorian. And that is a Lantina turn. So we'll talk about the Breathing Dragon loop next as an extra credit portion, just to show you guys what that would look like if you had a bit more counterblast to work with and you didn't decide to spend them on using Sylvia to build your board.